stop quoting facts that make historians laugh at you. You are walking around with a brain full of Victorian rumors and Hollywood scripts. It is time to wipe your memory clean. We are deleting the garbage you learned in school and replacing it with the ugly truth. Here are 101 history lies. 1. We need to apologize to the Egyptians because slaves did not build the Great Pyramids. Those workers were actually paid laborers who ate prime beef and drank gallons of beer every day. They were so respected they were buried right next to the pharaohs. Slaves do not get labor unions in tombs with a view. 2. If you see a Viking wearing a helmet with horns, you're looking at a costume from a 19th century opera. Real Vikings never wore them because having handlebars on your head in a sword fight is suicidal. The only thing those horns are good for is getting your neck snapped by the enemy. 3. Hollywood wants you to think every gladiator match ended in a bloodbath, but that is bad business. Gladiators were expensive investments, like modern prize fighters. Most matches had referees and ended with both guys walking away alive. Killing your star athlete every Tuesday is a terrible way to run a sports franchise. 4. Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned, mostly because the violin would not be invented for another 1,000 years. He wasn't even in the city when the fire started. He actually rushed back to organize the fire brigade, but history turned him into a villain because his political enemies wrote the books. 5. The Wild West was actually safer than a modern Walmart parking lot. Quick-draw duels at high noon almost never happened outside of movies. In famous towns like Tombstone or Dodge City, you had to check your guns at the sheriff's office. Gun control was stricter in the 1880s than it is today. 6. Stop telling your kids that Einstein failed math to make them feel better about their grades. The guy mastered differential calculus by age 15. When he saw a news article claiming he failed school, he laughed and said he was top of his class. He was a certified genius, not a late bloomer. 7. You assume everyone in the Middle Ages dropped dead at 30, but that is just a misunderstood statistic. The average was low only because infant mortality was insane. If you survived childhood, you could easily live to be 70 without modern medicine. They were not all dropping like flies in their 20s. 8. That story about the War of the Worlds radio broadcast causing mass panic is a total lie created by newspapers. There were no riots or suicides. The newspapers just wanted to make radio look dangerous because it was stealing their advertising money. You fell for a smear campaign from 1938. 9. Lady Godiva never rode a horse completely naked through the streets to lower taxes. That story was made up by monks 200 years after she died. At best, she might have ridden in her underwear, which was still scandalous, but full nudity was just a medieval monk's fantasy added to the script later. 10. The Trojan horse was probably not a giant wooden pony filled with Greeks. Historians think the horse was likely a metaphor for a battering ram covered in damp horse hides to stop fire arrows. Or it represents an earthquake that knocked down the walls. A literal gift-wrapped trap is just poetic nonsense. 11. Napoleon was not short. He was actually above average height for a Frenchman of his time. The British propaganda machine painted him as a tiny angry man just to mock him, and the confusion between French and British measurements sealed the deal. You are laughing at a guy who was taller than the average modern guy. 12. George Washington never had wooden teeth. His dentures were a horrifying nightmare mix of ivory, gold, lead, and real human teeth pulled from the mouths of slaves. So when he smiled on that $1 bill, he was not showing off timber. He was hiding a mouthful of misery. 13. Christopher Columbus did not sail to America to prove the Earth was round. Every educated person since ancient Greece knew the planet was a sphere. Columbus was actually just terrible at math and thought the ocean was way smaller than it really was. He was lucky, not a scientific genius. 14. If you visit Salem, stop looking for burn marks. The people accused of witchcraft in the famous American trials were never burned at the stake. They were hanged, and one poor guy was crushed under heavy rocks. Burning heretics was a European hobby, not a New England tradition. 15. Isaac Newton did not discover gravity because an apple bonked him on the head. He simply saw an apple fall while looking out a window and started wondering why it went down instead of sideways. The concussion story was just an embellishment to make physics sound less boring to school kids. 16. Pirates almost never buried their treasure. These guys were criminals with short life expectancies, so they spent their loot immediately on booze and gambling. Why hide gold in a hole when you might be hanged next week? Captain Kidd was practically the only one who actually did it, and he got caught. 17. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was actually Greek, a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals. She was the first ruler in her family to even bother learning the local Egyptian language. She was basically a European colonizer sitting on the throne of the Nile. 18. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb from scratch. He just improved on existing designs and bought the patents from other guys who got there first. Edison was a brilliant businessman and a ruthless patent troll, but he was definitely not the lone genius in the room. 19. Antonio Salieri did not murder Mozart out of jealousy. That is just movie drama. In reality, they were friendly rivals who even collaborated on a cantata together. Salieri actually taught Mozart's son music after Wolfgang died. The only thing Salieri killed was a few bottles of wine. 20. Benjamin Franklin did not propose the turkey as the national bird instead of the eagle. He just wrote a private letter to his daughter saying the eagle looked like a thief and the turkey was a more respectable bird. He was joking, not lobbying Congress for a poultry mascot. 21. The Spanish flu did not start in Spain. It likely started on a farm in Kansas or a base in France. It only got that name because Spain was neutral in the war, and the press there was free to report on the sickness, while everyone else censored the bad news. 22. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake," when told the peasants had no bread. That quote was written by Rousseau about a different princess years before Marie even became queen. Revolutionaries just pinned it on her because they hated her. It was literally 18th century fake news. 23. Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball in a cow pasture in Cooperstown. He was a Civil War general who never mentioned the game in his diaries. The sport actually evolved slowly from British games like rounders. The Doubleday story was just a marketing myth to make the sport feel purely American. 24. Those terrifying metal chastity belts were never used in the Middle Ages. They are actually fakes created in the 19th century as weird jokes or fetish items. No knight ever locked his wife in iron underwear before going on a crusade. That is a complete Victorian fabrication. 25. Mussolini did not make the trains run on time. The Italian railway system was already improving before he took power. And even under his rule, the trains were often late. That was just fascist propaganda designed to make a dictator look like a competent manager to the outside world. 26. That terrifying iron coffin with spikes inside wasn't torturing anyone in the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden is actually a hoax invented in the 19th century by museums, just to attract tourists. It is basically a Victorian spooky attraction, not a medieval execution method. 27. Diamond engagement rings are not an ancient tradition. De Beers invented the concept in the 1930s with a massive marketing campaign to sell surplus stones. Before that, people used all kinds of gems or just thimbles. You are spending 3 months' salary because an ad agency told you to. 28. Vincent van Gogh did not slice off his entire ear and mail it to a lover. He actually only severed a small part of the earlobe during a mental breakdown. And some historians now think his friend Paul Gauguin might have sliced it off with a sword during a heated argument. 29. Ponce de Leon was not searching for the fountain of youth in Florida. He was actually looking for gold and a good spot to build a colony. The story about the magical water was invented by his political rivals after he died to make him look like a gullible old fool. 30. Medieval people did not drink beer exclusively because the water was toxic. They knew where to find fresh springs and wells. They drank beer because it was packed with calories and fun, not because they were afraid of a glass of water. They liked getting buzzed just like us. 31. People in the Middle Ages did not use expensive spices to mask the taste of rotting meat. That is ridiculous economics. If you could afford cinnamon and cloves, you could definitely afford fresh steak. Only poor people ate bad meat, and they certainly could not afford pepper to cover it up. 32. Julius Caesar was almost certainly not born via C-section, despite the procedure bearing his name. In Roman times, that surgery was only performed on dead mothers to save the baby. Since Caesar's mother lived for many years after his birth, he definitely came out the old-fashioned way. 33. That chubby, laughing statue you see in Chinese restaurants is not actually Buddha. That is a Chinese folk deity named Budai from the 10th century. The real Siddhartha Gautama was an ascetic who fasted regularly and was likely incredibly skinny, not a guy who looked like he enjoyed a buffet. 34. Marco Polo did not bring pasta back to Italy from his trip to China. Historical records show that Italians were already eating dishes like lasagna centuries before Polo even packed his bags. He might have eaten noodles in Asia, but the Italians definitely did not need his help inventing dinner. 35. Ferdinand Magellan does not deserve credit for being the first person to circumnavigate the globe. He actually got himself killed in the Philippines halfway through the trip because he picked a fight with locals. It was his second in command, Juan Sebastian Elcano, who actually finished the voyage without him. 36. Napoleon Bonaparte is not responsible for shooting the nose off the Great Sphinx with a cannon. Sketches of the Sphinx from decades before he even arrived in Egypt show the nose was already missing. The real culprit was likely a religious fanatic in the 14th century, not the French army. 37. The Great Chicago Fire was not caused by Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern. That story was completely fabricated by a reporter who later admitted he made it up because he thought it made for colorful copy. The poor cow was framed for burning down the city. 38. The movie 300 makes it look like 300 shirtless gym bros held off the entire Persian army alone. In reality, the Spartans had about 7,000 other Greek allies fighting right beside them. The 300 were just the elite guard, not the entire defense force. Hollywood loves a lonely underdog. 39. George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree and confessed to his dad. That story was invented by a biographer named Mason Weems after Washington died, just to sell books to patriotic Americans. You were taught a complete fabrication designed to hype up a dead president's moral character. 40. That medieval law called prima nocta, where lords had the right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night, is a total myth. There is zero historical evidence it ever existed. It was likely a story invented later, just to make feudal lords look like even bigger jerks than they already were. 41. If a real ninja wore an all-black bodysuit, he would be the worst spy in history. Real ninjas dressed as farmers, monks, or merchants to blend in with the crowd. The black outfit idea actually comes from stagehands in Japanese theater who were supposed to be invisible to the audience. 42. Hitler did not invent the Autobahn to move his tanks around. The highway system was actually planned and started by the Weimar Republic years before the Nazis took power. Hitler just hijacked the project, finished the construction, and claimed it was his genius idea for propaganda purposes. 43. Paul Revere never rode through the streets shouting, "The British are coming." That would have been stupid because most people in Massachusetts still considered themselves British. He was on a secret mission and likely whispered, "The regulars are coming out to avoid alerting the enemy patrols roaming the area." 44. The Wall Street crash of 1929 did not cause a wave of bankers to jump out of windows. Statistics show the suicide rate in New York didn't spike significantly that month. The story was mostly a dark joke, circulating in tabloids that eventually morphed into a historical fact. 45. The Founding Fathers did not all gather on July 4th to sign the Declaration of Independence. Most of them actually signed it in August, and some stragglers didn't sign until months later. The holiday celebrates the approval of the text, not the actual autograph session. 46. Real cowboys almost never wore Stetson cowboy hats. In the Wild West, the most popular headgear was actually the bowler hat, also known as a derby. It stayed on your head better in the wind. The giant cowboy hats we see in movies were popularized much later by Hollywood. 47. Feminists in the 60s never actually burned their bras in protest. That is a total myth invented by a reporter who wanted to compare them to draft card burners to make them look crazy. They threw makeup and heels into a trash can, but no underwear was ever set on fire. 48. One of the grossest rumors in history is that Catherine the Great died trying to have sex with a horse. That was pure slander invented by her enemies in France to ruin her reputation. She actually died of a stroke on the toilet, which is embarrassing enough without the barnyard animals. 49. The owners of the Titanic never advertised the ship as unsinkable. That legendary phrase was actually coined by the press after the ship had already gone down to make the tragedy feel more ironic. The company only claimed it was practically unsinkable, which is lawyer speak for it might still sink. 50. The story of Pocahontas is nothing like the romance movie. She was a child of about 10 or 11 when she met John Smith, and they definitely did not fall in love. She later married an Englishman named John Rolfe, was paraded around London as a curiosity, and died tragically young at 21. 51. Pirates never made people walk the plank. That is a fictional trope popularized by Peter Pan and storybooks. If a pirate captain wanted to kill you, he would just throw you overboard or stab you immediately. They were efficient murderers, not theatrical performers trying to entertain a captive audience. 52. George Washington never wore a wig. That was his real hair. He just powdered it until it looked white because that was the trendy style of the time. So while other founding fathers were sweating under itchy horsehair rugs, Washington was just rocking a really high-maintenance hairdo. 53. The Battle of the Alamo did not end with every single person dying. While the soldiers were certainly wiped out, over a dozen women, children, and enslaved people were spared by the Mexican army and released. The "everyone died" story just works better for the legendary martyr narrative. 54. Hitler did not storm out of the stadium to avoid shaking hands with Jesse Owens. He actually waved at Owens from his box, and Owens waved back. Ironically, it was Franklin D. Roosevelt who snubbed Owens by never inviting him to the White House because of an election year. 55. 19th century Egyptians did not burn mummies as fuel for steam trains. That was a joke written by Mark Twain that people took literally. However, Europeans did grind up ancient mummies to make paint and medicine, which is honestly just as disturbing and disrespectful as burning them. 56. There is zero historical evidence that Christians were fed to lions, specifically in the Colosseum in Rome. Most Christian martyrdoms happened in other arenas or by other methods. The Colosseum lion story was largely amplified by later church writers to create a unified, dramatic symbol of persecution. 57. The Pilgrims did not eat turkey, potatoes, or pumpkin pie at the first Thanksgiving. There were no potatoes in North America yet, and they had no sugar or ovens for pie. They likely ate venison, shellfish, and eels. Your traditional holiday dinner is a complete historical lie. 58. Alexander Graham Bell did not invent the telephone first. An Italian immigrant named Antonio Meucci invented a working prototype years earlier, but could not afford the patent fee. Bell basically just had better funding and a faster lawyer, so he got the credit and the cash. 59. Rosa Parks was not the first black woman to refuse to give up her bus seat. A teenager named Claudette Colvin did it 9 months earlier in the same city. Civil rights leaders felt an unwed pregnant teen wasn't the right face for the movement, so they waited for Parks. 60. The Dark Ages were not actually dark or backward. It was a time of massive innovation in agriculture, architecture, and university systems. Renaissance scholars just called it dark later on to make their own era look smarter and more enlightened by comparison. You fell for their marketing. 61. Captain Cook did not discover Australia. Indigenous Australians had been living there for at least 65,000 years. Dutch explorers had also landed there and mapped parts of the coast over a century before Cook ever showed up. He was just the first to claim it for England. 62. The Pony Express was not a long-standing pillar of the Old West. It was a financial disaster that lasted only 18 months before the telegraph killed it. We only remember it because Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows turned a short-lived failed mail service into a massive legend. 63. Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. Ransom Olds, the founder of Oldsmobile, was using 1 year before Ford. Henry just perfected it by adding conveyor belts to speed things up. He was a master of efficiency, but he is not the father of the concept. 64. Women in the West didn't just start wearing pants in the 1960s. In the 1800s, women in mining towns often wore trousers out of necessity to do hard labor. It was illegal in many cities, but out on the frontier, fashion laws didn't matter when there was work to do. 65. Mozart was not buried in a pauper's mass grave because he was penniless. He was buried in a standard common grave because that was the law in Vienna at the time to prevent disease. He had a normal middle-class funeral, not the tragic, lonely ending movies like to show. 66. Southern belles didn't faint all the time because they were delicate flowers. They passed out because their corsets were crushing their lungs, and their makeup was often made of toxic lead and arsenic. They were literally being poisoned and suffocated by their own fashion trends. 67. George Washington never threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River. The river is over a mile wide, and silver dollars didn't even exist yet. He might have thrown a rock across the much narrower Rappahannock River, but the Potomac story is just a tall tale. 68. Ancient Roman and Greek statues were not originally gleaming white marble. They were painted in bright, tacky neon colors that would look ridiculous to us today. The paint just faded away over thousands of years, leaving the white stone we now worship as classy art. 69. The Titanic was not trying to set a speed record when it hit the iceberg. That is a movie myth. Not all of its boilers were even lit, and the captain was following a standard schedule. The idea of a reckless captain speeding through ice is pure drama, not reality. 70. A thumbs-down gesture in the Roman Colosseum did not mean kill him. It actually meant swords down, or let him live. A thumbs up likely meant to slice the jugular. Hollywood flipped the signs because they thought modern audiences would get confused by the reality. 71. King Arthur probably never existed. Despite all the movies about swords and wizards, there is no historical record of a king named Arthur ruling Britain in the 5th century. He is likely a fictional superhero character created by medieval writers combining stories of 5 different local warlords. 72. The Forbidden City in China was not built by slaves. It was constructed by over 1 million specialized craftsmen and laborers who were paid wages. While the work was brutal and dangerous, it was a massive government infrastructure project, not a slave camp. You are confusing dynasty economics with pyramid building. 73. Prohibition did not stop people from drinking. It actually made them drink more dangerous stuff. Alcohol consumption initially dropped but then surged as people switched to stronger, unregulated moonshine. The government basically created the mafia and poisoned its own citizens just to make a moral point that failed miserably. 74. The Berlin Wall did not fall because of a planned demolition. It fell because an East German official botched a press conference and accidentally announced that travel restrictions were lifted immediately. Thousands rushed the gates, and the confused guards just let them through. A bureaucratic screw-up changed history. 75. Richard III was not a hunchback. When his skeleton was found under a parking lot in 2012, it showed he had scoliosis, which made one shoulder slightly lower, but no hunch. Shakespeare gave him the deformity to make him look like an evil villain for his Tudor patrons. 76. We call it the Spanish Inquisition, but they were not the only ones doing it. Inquisitions were happening all over Europe, including France and Italy. The Spanish just got the worst reputation because Protestant propaganda in England worked overtime to make Spain look like the ultimate evil empire. 77. Julius Caesar never said, "Et tu, brute," as he was dying. That is a line from Shakespeare's play. According to Roman historians, he either said nothing or whispered a Greek phrase meaning, "You too, child," to Brutus. He was too busy bleeding out to deliver perfect poetic dialogue. 78. The samurai were not always loyal warriors who would die for their masters. During the Warring States period, betrayal was extremely common. Samurai switched sides constantly if the pay was better, or if they thought their current boss was going to lose. Loyalty was a luxury, not a rule. 79. World War I did not start just because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot. Europe was a powder keg of alliances and rivalries, waiting to explode for decades. The assassination was just the excuse everyone was looking for. If he hadn't been shot, something else would have started the war by Tuesday. 80. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all enslaved people in America. It only applied to states in rebellion against the Union. Slavery remained legal in border states like Kentucky and Delaware until the 13th Amendment was passed later. Lincoln's order was a military strategy, not a magic wand. 81. Hollywood westerns make you think bank robberies happened every Tuesday. In reality, they were incredibly rare. In the entire history of the Wild West, there were fewer than a dozen confirmed bank heists. Robbing a bank in a small town where everyone is armed is actually a terrible business plan. 82. William Wallace never wore a kilt in battle like in the movie Braveheart. Kilts were not invented until about 300 years after he died. He would have worn chainmail and a tunic. Mel Gibson was basically fighting a war in the wrong costume. 83. Betsy Ross likely did not sew the first American flag. The story didn't appear until a century later when her grandson started telling it to promote his own business. There is zero Revolutionary-era evidence linking her to the design. She was a flag maker, sure, but the first flag story is family marketing. 84. Dr. Guillotin did not invent the guillotine. It was designed by a surgeon named Antoine Louis. Guillotin just proposed using a machine to make executions more humane. He actually hated that his family name became forever linked to a device used for chopping off heads. 85. Benjamin Franklin was not a womanizer who slept his way through France. While he was definitely a flirt and loved female company, there is no evidence of the wild sex escapades people claim. He was an old man with gout who enjoyed charming ladies at dinner parties, not a colonial gigolo. 86. The shot heard round the world at Lexington was not necessarily fired by an American patriot. Nobody knows who shot first. It could have been a British soldier, a colonist, or even an accidental discharge. Both sides blamed the other to claim self-defense and seize the moral high ground. 87. Albert Einstein did not help build the atomic bomb. He was considered a security risk by the US government because of his pacifist views and was denied clearance to work on the Manhattan Project. His famous equation E equals mc squared explained the energy, but he never built the weapon. 88. The frantic gold rush image of everyone getting rich is a lie. Most prospectors in California went broke or died of disease. The people who actually got rich were the ones selling shovels, jeans, and overpriced eggs to the desperate miners. It was a transfer of wealth to merchants, not diggers. 89. Rome was not conquered in a day, and it didn't fall in a day either. The fall of Rome was a slow, agonizing decline that took centuries. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. It just slowly transformed from an empire into a mess of smaller kingdoms. 90. Gandhi was not always the peaceful saint you picture. In his younger years in South Africa, he actually wrote some pretty racist things about black Africans and supported the British Empire's wars. His philosophy of nonviolence evolved over time. He wasn't born a perfect moral icon. 91. The Aztecs almost certainly did not believe Hernán Cortés was a god. That story was invented decades after the conquest by Spanish historians to justify their brutal invasion. It makes the Aztecs look naive, and the Spanish look like divine destiny, but in reality, the Aztecs just saw them as dangerous invaders. 92. Joan of Arc never actually fought in battle or killed anyone. She was a strategist and a mascot who carried a banner to boost morale. While she was incredibly brave and did get wounded by an arrow, she wasn't swinging a sword and chopping off heads like an action movie star. 93. The White House was not painted white to cover up scorch marks from when the British burned it in the War of 1812. It was actually whitewashed with lime years before the war to protect the porous stone from freezing. The fire just gave them a good excuse to apply a fresh coat. 94. Captain Bligh from Mutiny on the Bounty was not the cruel villain movies portray. He was actually a naval hero who navigated a tiny lifeboat nearly 4,000 miles to safety after being dumped by his crew. The mutineers didn't rebel because of abuse. They just wanted to go back to partying in Tahiti. 95. The Magna Carta was not a victory for the common people or democracy. It was a deal between a king and a bunch of super-rich barons to protect their own wealth. It didn't give a single right to the 90% of the population who were peasants. It was a contract for the 1%. 96. That famous Rosie the Riveter. We Can Do It poster was not an icon during World War II. It was just an internal motivational poster for one Westinghouse factory and was displayed for only 2 weeks. It didn't become a famous feminist symbol until the 1980s, 40 years later. 97. People in the Middle Ages were not constantly dirty and smelly. Public bathhouses were actually extremely popular and common in medieval cities. People only stopped bathing as much later on because doctors stupidly started spreading the rumor that hot water opened your pores to the plague. 98. Mata Hari was not a master spy who used seduction to steal secrets. She was an aging exotic dancer who was likely innocent. The French government executed her simply because they needed a scapegoat to blame for their massive military failures during World War I. She was a victim, not a villain. 99. Vlad the Impaler is not seen as a monster in his home country of Romania. He is actually considered a national hero who defended his land against the massive Ottoman Empire. The Dracula vampire myth was mostly created by his enemies to ruin his reputation, and Bram Stoker just ran with it. 100. The suffragettes who fought for women's voting rights were not just peaceful protesters holding signs. In Britain, they were actually militant radicals who blew up mailboxes, smashed windows, and even learned jujitsu to fight off the police. They were essentially a domestic insurgent group fighting for equality. 101. The saying, "History is written by the victors," is actually a lie. History is written by the writers. The Mongols conquered half the known world, but because they didn't write many books, their history was written by the people they defeated, who naturally described them as mindless savages. The pen really is mightier than the sword. Your reality just got a factory reset. Hit subscribe so you don't fall for this nonsense again. Now, be honest. Which one of these facts do you absolutely refuse to believe? Pick the one you think I'm wrong about and try to prove it in the comments. Go ahead, I dare you.